Welcome to another webinar of this is our third webinar in 2023, always with the idea of increasing the scientific content, showing the researchers that contribute to our publication, like today's webinar, always broaching subjects that are interesting and important, relevant for our practice in anesthesiology. I like to remember everyone that they are recorded and made available in our YouTube channel. They're translating real time into English, allowing our foreign friends to access and interact within the content that is being discussed during these activities. And I ask all of you to access our webinars. They are recorded on this platform and to share this with your colleagues. And I would like to also say that our latest edition, 73, in management economics and new technologies in anesthesiology, is already available for reading, for sharing, for downloading on our site in all the channels which the publication is involved. So share it with your colleagues. It's very important for us to spread the word on the magazine and the publication and the journal. And I like to mention the access to our last podcast a few days ago, which approaches an article, a paper that deals with induced hypoxia by anemia during the operation. It's by Dr. Gregory Hare. He is being interviewed in the podcast by Professor Rafael Zamper, a member of our journal, editor, member of the editorial committee of the journal, who approaches this question together with Professor Gregory Hare. You can't miss the podcast. It's a very relevant international podcast that I recommend to all of you. So finally, I'd like to pass the word to our moderator for today's webinar, Professor Vanessa Henriques Carvalho. He is a teacher in the State University of Campinas and our associate editor for the Brazilian Journal. Please, Professor Vanessa, go ahead. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Andre Schmidt, for the presentation. I'd like to thank you all for being here. We have our president, Maria Angela Tardelli, and Dr. Plinio da Cunha Real, and Dr. Kathia, and our friends Mel from SBA, and our listeners and our audience. Also, I have the honor of moderating this webinar. It is a subject that really makes a difference on our daily life in obstetric anesthesia. From the start of CRASH 1, CRASH 2, woman trial, and CRASH 3, these are papers work involving DXA, tranexamic acid, and now the great work, a systematic revision with meta-analysis authored by Dr. Ivo de Assis. Dr. Ivo, now presenting as residence in anesthesiology by the CETSB University of Brazil. He is an anesthesiologist certified by the Golden Garden and the DASN Network. He is an anesthesiologist
da região leste, Secretaria de Estado de Saúde do Distrito Federal.
within the Federal University in SUS. So Dr. Ivo, it is an honor to have you here with this webinar presenting your work published on the Brazilian Journal of Anesthesiology, and I pass the floor to you. Have a good presentation. His microphone is not currently on. So, and on mute. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Vanessa. Thank you, Dr. Maria, all of you for being here, for a chance of being here today presenting this paper, which was published on BJAN last year, August, where we had the analysis of the efficacy of the prophylactic use of tranexamic acid in preventing postpartum hemorrhage. We had a systematic revision, but a analysis of randomized clinical trials. And so why did we perform this meta-analysis? Well, it was because of the importance. Please, next slide. Next slide, go ahead. The importance of this illness. And we compare this, most of the reports and papers dealing with this say that this is an illness that has an incidence of up to 5% in the whole world, depending on the paper that you read. the total of maternity deaths, it can represent up to a fourth of them, seeing as on middle income, well, developing countries, this percentage can become even a third. This includes our country. In Brazil, according to Fiocruz data, postpartum bleeding is the second leading cause of maternal deaths. It only leads to pregnancy and hypertension during pregnancy. And here we have a heat map so we can see the darker the pink is, the higher the incidence. We are on this darker group, even though it's not as bad as a few regions in Africa, but we are also not quite as well in Central Europe. So this global south, as it is called, which is Africa, Southeast Africa, this is where this is a more significant issue. And these are the regions that have lesser resources to be able to deal with this. Next slide, please. So first, we need to understand what postpartum bleeding is. According to WHO, postpartum bleeding is a bleeding that occurs in the purpose period if it happens within 24 hours. So if it's above 500 milliliters, it's a serious bleeding. After above 1,000 is serious bleeding. So if there's a prior history, nulliparity, hyperdistension, if we believe that the main cause of postpartum bleeding is uterine, and the causes that lead us to hyperdistension, macrostomy, and there's others as well with a prevalence that is a bit lower, like induction, dysfunctioning coagulation, and like prolonged birth periods. A few papers mention peridural anesthesia as a risk factor for postpartum hemorrhage, but this is not a consensus. So next slide, please. So keeping in mind this is a high prevalence illness, every health professional that works with obstetrics, from the obstetrician, the emergency doctor, the anesthesia that works within an obstetrician environment, they are going to run into this event at some point during their career, probably more than once. This is very important for us to be prepared to be able to deal with this situation. Despite having all these risk factors, only 1/3 of all hemorrhage, postpartum hemorrhage bleedings state with this and identifiable risk factors. Currently, the most protocols for post, they use traditional uterotonics, especially oxytocin, emetol, oligomethrin. Thinking about that logic that the highest cause of postpartum hemorrhage is uterine atony. If we have a situation that has a high incidence, it is very prevalent in more impoverished regions, and the treatment is very costly from a human point of view as well as a resource point of view. If we can develop a strategy of prevention, this will be in a certain way more intelligent. If we're thinking about regions with few resources, we would not need a effective tool, but effective cost. Will be a cheaper medication that will be easy to apply. And in this context, we said add tranexamic acid. That's how it goes into our radar. First, let's remember how tranexamic acid acts. Tranexamic acid is a synthetic alkobolizine that inhibits fibrinolysis, activating the plasminogen and avoiding the creation of the complex will lead to degradation of coagulation, creating a TPA complex, which will connect fibrin and degrade coagulation. When we impede the formation of this structure, coagulation continues stable. So having this, we have a low-cost medication. It's relatively easy to use, and literature mentions a low incidence of side effects. Top of this, in the last decade, we had the appearance of several papers which consolidated tranexamic acid in the treatment of several other comorbidities, a few other illnesses that are related to this, such as the woman study. This is a large clinical trial that established tranexamic acid during the treatment of postpartum bleeding, and CRASH 2, which established the use of tranexamic acid within the context of trauma
Então, se ele diminuiu o
bleeding.
sangramento,
So if it diminishes bleeding in gestation, when a person that is already going through postpartum bleeding has a low incidence of side effects, why not use it before the postpartum bleeding establishes itself? Can you please continue? Okay, so the goal of our systematic revision was to assess the effect of tranexamic acid over the volume of peripartum bleeding when administered prophylactically on pregnant women. And how did we do this? Well, first off, to select our slides, the criteria of inclusion was randomized studies, double-blind studies with a placebo involving vaginal as well as C-sec births, the pregnant women that were assessed during as well as after birth, the use of TXA. So only English language was published January 24, 2004, and January 2020. We used the PRISMA directives in the creation of the protocol or study protocol, as well as to base ourselves to write our article. We researched on the based on PubMed, Embase, and Cochrane Library. Our main outcome was the measurement of the volume of bleeding in the peripartum period. It's worth noticing that before starting our research, we based our research protocol on Prospera platform, which is for the registry of protocols of systematic revision. So if you want to put the code up and see our protocol, what our proposal was that we follow the methodology correctly, just use this code and you can check it. As a secondary outcome on top of the volume, we have as a goal to measure the variation of hemoglobin, incidence of side effects, use of uterotonics, and the need of hemotransfusions. So for the subgroup analysis, we planned to have an analysis comparing this different types of birth, the risk factors for postpartum bleeding, and the difference in the administration times of the drug. So how was our research, database research? It was done before 10th of March 2020 up to 12th of March of 2020. Used the terms postpartum puerperal hemorrhage and tranexamic acid with the use of and/or connectors. On the left, we have the research key, which is on Embase and Cochrane, what it filtered for clinical trials. And on the right, we have the research key we used on PubMed. On the, you can see these filters right here for the clinical trial. If you are anybody that is curious, if you haven't want to know how we created this key, we made this available. Please can continue. Okay, so once we got the results in the database, we went towards the preliminary reading of the titles in the summary with the help of two researchers from RYAN tool. The RYAN tool is a tool developed by Doran and Qatar to help researchers to be able to perform the systematic revision. It's very practical. It's a very intuitive layout. You can see the titles, whether the titles were accepted or not. During this phase, we already excluded all the research that was inaccessible to just step away. A lot of research were simply studies that use the article controls. Instead of a placebo, it uses a traditional treatment with global intervention. In the cases that there is a divergence between two researchers or three researchers would go in to have the final say. Please continue. So here we have an example of our chart in the second phase of selection. The papers that went for the second phase, we put them on a table, and every column, every row was criteria to see if it fit into our inclusion criteria or not. So at the end, we had an X saying whether the paper was included or not. So during this phase, we already had the full reading of the papers to know things that are not in the abstracts, whether it was actual blinding during the research, whether it was randomized, that kind of thing. And starting from there, the papers that were selected on the second phase, we sent the volume data for the bleeding and the standard deviation to another sheet. So those going from the secondary analysis and subgroup analysis. For the statistical analysis, we studied the randomized studies of Dersimone and Laird. Our measurement effect was the relation of the different averages, the interval conflict of intervals, 95%. The statistic was p less than 0.05. For our heterogeneity, we use squared p Higgins test, and we consider heterogeneity if the p is lesser than 0.05.
Acima de ou igual a 50%.
Squared will be higher or equal to 50%. So to check the publication bias, we use the Beck-and-Egger test with a Vos analysis of the funnel chart. To analyze the impact of our study, we use the grade system with the aid of the Grade Pro GDT program. Following the guidelines, the methodological guidelines, this grade system published by the Ministry of Health of Brazil, which has a protocol for the grade system that is its own for studies aimed towards the health sector. For the bias quality analysis, we use risk of bias 2.0 or ROB2 or ROB2. And in the case of secondary outcomes and subgroup analysis that we had no data to perform a meta-analysis, we had a qualitative analysis. So this is the result of our search. On the right, we have our Plasma flow chart, and on the database, we have a total of 630 papers. On top of those 630 papers, we found 16 direct search, which is where we search articles through reference, so somebody found it and sent it to us. And on this first attempt, Ryan already excluded 185 duplicates from the reading of the summary of 461, and during this phase, 422 were excluded. So for the full reading of the second phase, 39 papers, 22 were excluded during the full reading due to several reasons, which we'll seen here, mainly because a lack of placebos or a lack of blinding and placebos at the same time. So 17 papers were classified for qualitative analysis, but one of them divulged data for bleeding volume without the standard deviation. So we could have no meta-analysis like that. So for meta-analysis, we used 16 clinical trials. Out of this 16, we have a total of 6,701 patients, 3,361 that use the drug, and 3,340 on placebo. As for the countries, most of them came from 3 countries.
Irã e Egito, cada desses países tinham 3 artigos cada. China, Paquistão, Tailândia, França e Nepal ficaram com
France and Nepal had 1 each, 3 from Turkey, Iran, India, and Egypt. This has a lot of numbers. It's mainly global South countries, middle income, underdeveloped countries, or developing countries where the incidence of postpartum bleeding is more worrisome. So here we have the results of our meta-analysis. On the first, we in fact saw a diminishment on the bleeding volume, more than 131 milliliters, with a trust interval that is adequate. We can see that the diamond is the square is far away from a certain line, and the p is 0.00. So what will be good to speak about the Goswami trial is an Indian researcher, and he used 2 different doses of tranexamic acid in his research, 2 groups, one with 15 milligrams per kilo, one with 10, and then a placebo group. So for statistical analysis purpose, we separate him in 2 different research studies, different papers, but they are compared with the same placebo group. So we double the research on this side. So on the analysis of arguments, we only managed to get enough where a result here is the variation of hemoglobin, and we saw that there is a diminishment in its solution, 0.4 grams per deciliter, and a trust interval that is also adequate, far away from the central axis. And on this stage, the usage of these in these 16 studies, only these 7 worked with this measurement of variation of hemoglobin as an outcome. So we can keep going. So when it comes to the other outcomes, we assess the qualitative analysis relating to the side effects. 9 papers did not report whether or not they had side effects, according to their authors. The ones that did report these, we point out 2 papers where there was a rare occurrence, but without any difference between 2. No statistical did the shoe paper study from China. There's 2 thromboembolic events in each group without a statistical significance. And the Centiles, we're going to speak a bit more about this study, this paper, because a pretty large study with a pretty high impact on our sample size. Were 4 thromboembolic in placebo and 1 intervention. So we had more patients in placebo than intervention, and 1 case of convulsions. For a study that had 4,000 patients, it's a relatively low incidence rate. The remaining clinical trials, those with description only of light effects on the intestinal tract, such as vomit, diarrhea, nausea, more serious matters. None of them were reported. When it comes to the use of etratonics, 9 papers perceived the reduction of their use, pointing out Gongorduk, which was from Egypt, was a reduction of 69%, and Zetiles, there was also a reduction of 25%, due to it being on a higher number of population participants. It's pretty significant. We can keep going, please. When it comes to the use of hemoderivates, the use was assessed by 11 papers. There was not a lot of difference amongst the groups. Special mention to Abbas. There was a reduction of 76% in the transfusion in the whole group, but it was a paper that used high-risk patients. The inclusion criteria that they had placenta acrotism. It was a paper about bleeding on placenta acrotism. So it's a patient that will bleed a lot, and the sample size is small, so that reduces the impact. When it comes to the subgroup analysis, sensitivity analysis, the only one where we managed to have a meta-analysis was relating to the type of birth. Those CSEC actually showed an even higher reduction of bleeding, by a reduction of almost 170 mLs for bleeding on average. So 30 milliliters more than the general acidity trust interval that is adequate, and the P was 0.000. We consider this the fluorescence graph chart. As you can see, the diamond was pretty far away from the central line, and in this situation here, we had a good amount of papers that performed this assessment, a few of them only having surgical birth and others with CSEC. So it's a pretty heterogeneous research. So Musk only had CSEC birth, so the use of tranexamic acid was high there. So for other sensitivity papers, we only managed to make a qualitative analysis. The risk factors, they were inclusion criteria in free study. Abbas then had inclusion criteria or acrotism Goswami, which has this criteria for inclusion, anemia. Sujata, where any risk factor was an inclusion criteria. All the others, the risk factor was an exclusion criteria, including the heterogeneity of our sample size. Within the risk criteria, the most common ones considered were uterine hyperdistension due to the dominant factor and the presence of a coagulation disturbia, which is a causal logic. And one curious thing was the multiparity was considered a risk factor in 5 papers, but in the literature, it is not well established as, in fact, a risk factor for postpartum bleeding. When it comes to the administration time, was very different between all studies, but almost all of them focus on a period between 20 minutes before birth and 5 minutes afterwards. So on top of it being heterogeneous, basically didn't make that much of a difference. So our publishing bias, you can see that most of this, we had few studies on the left of the chart, the funnel chart. Most of them are on the outside, reinforcing evidence. Some of the Agar and bag test, Agar and bag text. The heterogeneity of the sample was also high because our slice was 50, so the result was 98.22. So when it comes to the quality of the evidence, according to grade, was considered moderate for the main outcome as well as the secondary outcome. Here you can see the chart, so you have an idea of how the program works with this. Each of these lines, lines of cells, it's a criteria that you must fill out. The program will give you this result. What the importance of the quality of the evidence and the importance of the results. Please continue. So the bias was we had two papers with a high risk of bias, Mediated and Sinturk, and 11 had some concern. Only 4 managed to pass, but from all their criteria with a low bias risk. So about the discussion, we in fact saw that TXA and its prophylactic shows itself as being efficient for the reduction of hemorrhage in this meta-analysis. It is plausible if we think that this is a action mechanism for the medication and this use was already established in other larger studies. And if we think that prevention is always a better strategy than treatment itself, this reinforces this is in favor of the use of TXA because we can see that it does reduce the use of medication. It can make it so that we have other clinical outcomes, and we'll discuss this further on. This is according to prior revisions. In 2015, we have a large revision by Cochrane with 12 papers that also saw a reduction in the volume of the bleeding. But from 2015 until now, I mentioned 2020, which is when we performed the meta-analysis for several other clinical trials were already published. And we want to see the impact of these new clinical trials in a meta-analysis. Please continue. And the main thing was this paper published by Santillis in 2018. Santillis is a French researcher. He published a lot, like Santillis. He performed a large study with almost 4,000 patients, only vaginal births, and by far the highest weight in our analysis, highest amount of people. Well, it's interesting that this study did not see a difference in the bleeding, but it did see a difference in the use of uterotonics. In a certain way, the separation makes sense for, since you may not have bled more, but you need to use some more medication so the patient would not bleed. So if there's no administration of more medication, she probably would have bled more. In fact, please continue. So when it comes to a high heterogeneity, several things could explain this. First off, the difference in the interval of measurement among several groups. There was papers that measured 5 minutes before incision up till the last point. There were papers that measured till the exit of the placenta until the last point, and then from the when the baby left a womb up till 20 minutes later. This interval was very different among studies, increasing our heterogeneity. There was also different physiology of TXA. This could have influenced things as well, even though all of them were when what was normal. There was no absorbed dose of what we see the variable between kilos 10 to 20 milligrams per kilo, and the remaining ones at the dose of 1 gram. So it's also different populations, as we saw. A few studies had risk factor patients, and a few others did have a risk factor. So different methods. Some papers had a calculation of the hemorrhage based on the estimated calculation using hemoglobin. So it was estimated volume, or studies measured what was on the vacuum. So this also increases our heterogeneity. So, going. When it comes to our secondary outcomes, the variation of hemoglobin So the bleeding, you can see a lesser variation in hemoglobin. This is quite clear. So when it comes to the adverse effects, we saw, despite not being a meta-analysis on the qualitative analysis, it was not a very big concern, reinforcing what was being said in other systematic revisions in other reports with simply two studies. There was a small incidence, the thromboembolic events, which is what we think about when we speak about a medication that inhibits the dissolution of the population. They were not significant, but several studies, the presence of adverse events, it was a reason for inclusion. So this reflects the incidence of these events with the study. So we continue. So analysis, you can see there was data for meta-analysis was also coherent to us according to our results when it comes to the surgical study, the subgroups relating to a surgical. We had a higher effect of tranexamic acid. It makes sense if there was a surgical procedure that bleeds most, and then it bleeds more, we have an opportunity for the tranexamic acid to act. But it's worth pointing out that as with Centilius, our larger study with a higher sample size, all of our studies, this is a paper that only dealt with vaginal birth, and it was a negative paper. If you get this out of the sample, you'll end up favoring positive results. So we have this result in accordance with C-sex. So the other subgroup analysis, it was very heterogeneous, the measurement methods, so is what impeded us of the statistical analysis. We saw that, or pointing out the matter of the administration time, despite why heterogeneity, the variation was small, we don't believe it was a lot of influence. Please continue. So when it comes to the ROP2 biases, every domain had at least one issue, and most of these issues were related to the selection topic of their select results. This happened because most of the papers did not register the prior protocol. So they started the research in clinical trials or RABEC. They did not have this, and simply not having this, the program would classify this. It removes one point of the assessment of the paper. Both papers, despite diverse, and so that's why we don't think it harmed the final results. Rate was the same thing. It did not point up any inconsistency, showing that all studies in the same trended in the same direction. Despite this, our paper showed that tranexamic acid was efficient to reduce bleeding volume, but we do not know if this is reproduced into cost effectiveness, since this was not a paper that managed to measure side effects collaterally, and we are only seeing objective criteria. We do not know if this reduction of 130, 170 milliliters reflects on a lessening of morbidity or mortality, higher survival rate. We saw that there was a reduction in the use of tonics, but the reduction of clinical trials that matter. Right? So a general adoption of medication, especially on a situation of scarcity, must be very well scientifically grounded. So the conclusion is that the prophylactic use of tranexamic acid is in fact efficient to the reduction of bleeding, postpartum bleeding, especially during C-sex, with those caveats that we had. But as we just considered, general usage, and because of this, we will continue performing some research. I would like to have the opportunity to show some studies that were launched recently that are not in meta-analysis, but it's worth mentioning. This is another paper by Centilles, this time only using C-section. First, remember that the other one was only natural birth. So in April of 2021, we had just finished a meta-analysis, and I saw this publication. I thought, man, geez, you had a little bit more time, we could include it into the study. And then the bleeding, blood, secondary clinical outcomes, so there was no difference on the clinical outcomes, no difference in transfusion, no difference on survival rate. And another study just came out of the oven in a New England Journal of Anesthesiology, and also analyzed the prophylactic use of tranexamic acid only on C-sex. And this specific study from last month, the main outcome, primary outcome, with clinical outcomes, so term mortality and blood transfusion. So there was no difference between both groups. Please continue. So, having said that, we see that despite the medication doing its job as it proposes so to, it still hasn't proved if it's worth using in a general manner or not. We mentioned that the authors of these paper have no financial interest and it was financed with our own resources. So thank you, everyone. If you have any
Responder.
Muito bem. Excelente,
Okay,
doutor Ivo.
great.
Em
Excellent,
primeiro lugar,
Dr.
gostaria de
Ivo. First off,
parabenizar
I would like to
pelo excelente
congratulate
trabalho.
you.
Não é
A great
fácil
job.
fazer
It's not
uma análise de
easy to
16
have a meta-analysis
RCTs
with
e
16
principalmente
RCTs,
a
and
heterogeneidade
really the
há diversos
heterogeneity.
fatores, né?
There are several
São
factors involved.
questões
These are matters
realmente
that really
da
make us think
efetividade do
when it comes
resultado, na
to
verdade. E até era uma pergunta
the
que eu gostaria
effectivity
de
of the
fazer.
results. And that was a question that I wanted to ask
Dados
you.
estatísticos, né?
Okay, you have
Uma
statistical
metodologia
data.
impecável,
There
né, como você
was
falou,
an
excluente,
impeccable methodology. You had to grade.
o que há de melhor, né,
You
na
used the
meta-análise de
best
alta
you had
qualidade.
in a high quality meta-analysis.
E eu te pergunto,
And I asked you,
os
it
seus
was
resultados, os
clear,
seus
the
dados tinham um
results
ponto
were
de
clear that there
correção
was a difference, a
estatística em
statistical
relação ao
difference
volume,
when it came to the
redução
volume, the reduction of the volume of bleeding.
pensando
But
também no valor médio, né, de
thinking about
130
the
ml.
average cost of
Para
130
nós, que
milliliters
fazemos
for
muita
us,
anestesia obstétrica,
we
isso
perform a lot of
existe?
obstetric anesthesia. Clinically,
Será que é um valor considerável?
is it a
Nós sabemos
considerable
que
cost?
os pacientes sangram em cesarianas, podem
I mean,
sangrar 40
patients that
ml,
may
justamente por
bleed
causa
up to 1,000 milliliters
as
were used for
dilatações
this kind of
vaginais de
thing, or
500 ml, quer dizer,
non-CSEC bursts
a
up
gente
to
sabe que
500
cesariana,
milliliters. We
tudo bem,
know
né, em
that
cesarianas é
bleeding is a
10%
lot.
do
Okay,
valor do
cesarean doctor
sangramento,
is
mas e aí,
10% of the cost, but clinically,
né, a gente pensando para um uso
thinking about
profilático,
the prophylactic use,
você acha que é um
do you
valor
think it's a
considerável?
considerable cost?
Doutora, assim, até pelo que a gente viu nos
Well,
estudos mais
doctor,
recentes
from
vendo
what we saw in the
a
more
receita
recent
final,
studies,
a princípio
the
não se
final
justificaria
outcomes,
se a gente fosse basear
on
apenas
principle, it would
por
not be
isso, né?
justified if
A
we
senhora
based
falou
ourselves only
150
on the
ml por uma cesariana
150
não é muita
mLs
coisa,
for a
né?
CSEC. It's not a
E
lot.
mostra que a medicação faz o seu trabalho,
Shows that
mas o que a
it
gente
does its
precisa
work,
é, a
but
princípio, o
it's
seu
not
uso
justify
generalizado.
the principle of
A
its
gente sabe que no
generalized
dia a
use. We
dia,
know that on
cada
day
vez
to
mais
day,
o ácido tranexâmico
we're
se
on
torna
board that
medicamentoso, né?
tranexamic
O
acid
receituário já
is
pede lá,
turning into
ó,
Dipron.
ácido tranexâmico aí,
The surgeon says,
e
"Oh, use Dipron
eu só
TXA
estou
over there."
começando a saber disso também, até porque nem todo
People are starting to get the
obstetricista
notice
em outras
because not just
especialidades vê que
obstetricians,
melhora a
but in other
qualidade deles
specialties, they see that
lá,
it
sangrento e
improves on their
tal.
field, on their
Agora,
bleeding.
se a gente
But
pensar como indicação para redução
we
de
think about
desfecho,
the indication for reduction of
que não foi o
outcomes.
objetivo da nossa
It's
meta-análise,
not goal of our
a princípio
meta-analysis.
não está indicado.
In principle, it is not
Eu
indicated.
concordo com a senhora, não se
I agree
justifica.
with you. It's not justified.
Pelo esse volume de sangramentos por si
The
só
bleeding
não
volume on
justificaria um
its
uso
own would not
generalizado.
justify the
Foi isso
general
que a gente
usage.
percebeu
And
que
that's what we realize
esse
here.
pequeno sangramento, como a gente
Now,
vê
this
por
small
estudos, não
bleeding,
se
as we see in the
reflete
last studies, does not
em
reflect
repercussão clínica final.
on final clinical
Pois é, até uma
repercussions.
pergunta
And that was a
aqui
question
do doutor, ó,
actually
muito
here by
prazer,
Dr.
doutor Maurício
Dr.
Vasco,
Mauricio
colega
Vasco.
do
It's an
nosso
honor
webinar.
in our webinar.
Ele pergunta para você, doutor Ivo,
Yes, Dr. Ivo.
seria o efeito, né,
What
dos
would be the
resultados
effect on
do nosso
results
estudo
of
da
a future
meta-análise sobre o
meta-analysis
efeito da ácido
on the
tranexâmico nos
effect of
pacientes,
tranexamic acid
né?
and
Vamos nós vamos
prevention of
concluir os
postpartum
resultados desse
hemorrhage,
RCT recente que
including the
foi
results of this recent RCT that you just showed
publicado no New England também.
on the New England publication
Bom,
as well. So,
primeiro,
well,
eu acredito que ele não
I
vai
believe
mudar muita coisa, porque
it would
foi o
not
que
change a
ele
lot.
manteve a lógica, né? Ele não viu nenhum. O desfecho primário
There
desse
was
estudo era a
no
mortalidade
primary outcome of the study was
e
the survival
transfusão,
rate,
né?
the
Outras repercussões
mortality,
clínicas, que
and
não viu diferença.
whether clinical
Isso que a
like
gente,
transfusion. There was no
outros studies já
difference.
mostravam.
This is something that
Porém,
other studies already
na
showed.
análise secundária
But on
dele,
a secondary
se não me
analysis,
engano, eu não lembro
not
exatamente, é
mistaken,
uma análise secundária, ele mediu o volume sanguíneo. E
how
eu
it
não me
measured the
lembro
blood
se
volume,
houve
and I don't
redução
know
do volume sanguíneo. Se ele viu
if there
redução do
was
volume
a
sanguíneo,
reduction in the
isso
blood
reforçaria
volume.
nossos
If
resultados,
it
porque o
happened, it would
resultado
reinforce our
mediu o volume
results
sanguíneo.
because
E
our
é o
goal was
objetivo
to measure
principal.
blood volume.
Eu estou até abrindo
That
aqui
was
para
our main
conhecer
outcome.
outros
I'm
estudos
actually
que
opening this up.
Mencionou alguma coisa
is as I'm actually considering up to 500 milliliters. And I think actually up to a liter, up to 1 liter, 500 milliliters. I think I can't remember this, but I think that it has had an effect, but it does not show a consequence in the clinical trials.
Talvez até sim, sim.
Here's a meta-analysis.
Como tem comentário, outro comentário.
As there is another comment,
Também,
I guess for you as well.
que talvez em regiões com menos recursos
Maybe on regions with less resources,
considerável,
will be considered the use of tranexamic acid
Agora,
as a prophylactic.
lembrando que
But
nada
remember that
justifica a
nothing
ausência da
justifies
toxina, né? Para todo o
uh,
pessoal que
lack
faz
of use of
análises
oxytocin. Remember that the
obstétricas,
highest use
então uma coisa não substitui a outra, né?
of oxytocin, one thing does not
Microfone vai
substitute
sempre.
another. Uterine tonics
A gente está
should
pensando
always be
aí
used.
em uma
Now we're
algo para
thinking that
adicionar, né?
something
Não
to
para
add,
substituir.
A gente deixa bem claro, né? E talvez também,
very
assim,
clear, and
pensando,
also thinking
seria
about
excelente
a
trabalho
great
focado
or
nas
to see
pacientes
some work
muito
focused on
baixo
high-risk
principalmente as
patients
implantações anormais
postpartum,
placentárias, como você citou, como
especially as you
acretismo,
cited,
ou até
acretism.
patologias que cursam, né, com a HELP síndrome, né, quer dizer, as plaquetopenias. Hoje a gente até teve uma
We
paciente
had a
aqui
patient
no
today
CAPDM na Unicamp,
here in Unicamp.
bom, e que
Well,
realmente, né, são pacientes que podem se
these are
beneficiar
patients that can
com a redução de
benefit
sangramento, que seja
from
zero,
reduction in bleeding.
mas que para uma
And it may
paciente
be minimal, but for
descompensada
a
pode realmente
patient that
fazer
has out of control bleeding, it can
E
make a
aí, tanto que a
difference.
gente até tentou fazer essa
And we
análise
actually tried
de desfecho secundário, considerando
having
todos esses
analysis of
fatores de risco, mas
outcomes,
infelizmente a gente não teve dados
but
suficientes. A
sadly
gente
we did
preferiu
not
fazer
have
essa
enough
análise
data. We managed to
qualitativa.
have a qualitative analysis and so on.
excelente, doutora.
Great, Dr. Andre.
Bom, parabéns, Ivo, excelente.
Congratulations, Ivo. Great presentation. We have a question of Dr. Vanessa, as she mentioned, the indication, the subgroups. There's a certain way you concluded based on your work that there would not be, you don't have to prophylactic use. It means there will not be enough evidence for this. The use of scientific evidence. If we think about clinical outcomes, no.
Dentro do que ela falou a respeito desses subgrupos,
But
né,
as you said, within
que
these
pacientes
subgroups,
eventualmente
patients
maior risco de
eventually with
sangramento,
high risk of bleeding,
a plausibilidade biológica
as
é
a
bem razoável. E essas evidências
biological
de redução de
plausibility,
sangramento,
and this
você
evidence in the
já
reduction of
recomendaria
bleeding
o profilático
would
nesse
already
ambiente?
recommend the
E aí,
prophylactic uterine
entrando nessa
use and
questão,
evidence.
até
And
a
listen to
pergunta
this
feita pela
matter, the
doutora Maria
question asked by
Cecília, a
Dr.
respeito
Maria
da dose
Cecilia,
utilizada, né, que nós
the
deveríamos usar nesses casos. Você
utilize
acha que
those
considera,
in this
baseado no que
data
você
and consider
estudou
this
para esses
based on
pacientes de
what you
risco,
study for these
valeria a
risk
pena
patients?
utilizarmos
Would it be
a
worth to
dose
use
profilática
the
e que dose
prophylactic
e qual
dose?
timing
And
baseado,
what
mesmo
is the dose and
considerando
what is
a
the timing?
heterogeneidade do
Maybe
trabalho,
considering the
né? E eu
heterogeneity of the
vejo,
work.
aproveitando e
In my
comentando, eu
eyes,
concordo com a
commenting,
professora
I
Vanessa que
agree with
a droga é
Professor
segura,
Vanessa
ela
that
talvez tenha
the
uma
drug is
eficácia
safe, maybe it
significativa em
will have a
termos
significant
de sangramento,
efficacy.
ela tem uma
When it comes
eficácia,
to
esses
bleeding, it
estudos
has
mostram,
efficacy,
e
as the
nessas
studies
populações de
show.
risco, mesmo
And
elas
in
não
these risk
tendo sido
populations, even
amplamente
if they are
estudadas,
not being
né,
amply
há
highly
uma
studied,
boa
it
possibilidade
is
de
a
usarmos
good
a
possibility
medicação
of
com segurança. Eu
using
queria saber a opinião
medication with safety. So I
sobre
wanted to
essa
know
questão.
your opinion
Concordo,
regarding that.
concordo sim.
I
Considerando
agree.
que eu, na minha prática pessoal,
In
se
my
eu vejo um
personal
paciente com
practice,
risco
if
de
I see a
sangramento
patient with a
como um
risk of
fator de risco
bleeding,
importante, né,
an important risk
eu já
factor,
peço para deixar um pouco
I
perto, às vezes eu
ask them to
já até
leave
faço
the
profilático
needle
antivírus,
nearby. I actually have the prophylactic
porque considerando
use
que
already
tem
because
baixíssimo risco, né, eu
considering
acho
there is a low
arriscado
risk,
o benefício supera o custo.
the
Mas,
benefit
assim, isso seria
surpasses the cost.
por uma questão de experiência
But
pessoal
due
mesmo que a
to
gente vê por aí e
personal
que eu converso com outros colegas que
experience,
trabalham com anestesia obstétrica
as I talked to
também.
my
Porque
colleagues that
eu
work
não
on
achei nenhum
obstetric
estudo
anesthesia as well,
específico
I
que
did not find any
trabalhasse em
specific
população de
study that
risco,
worked on
que
the
os,
at-risk population,
assim, revisão
a
sistemática, né,
systematic
nenhuma
revision,
recomendação específica para
any
população de
specific
risco,
recommendation for
recomendando isso
at-risk
além de eu direto
population,
de
recommended
imagem.
this on a
A gente
guideline
usa,
level.
né, isso,
So
vocês trabalham com obstetrícia,
Quais
sabem que a
seriam
gente
os
usa.
what
subgrupos
would
que
be the
você
subgroup
recomendaria baseado no que estudou, além
that
da
you recommend
implantação
based on what you studied?
anormal de placenta? Existe
So on
algum
top
outro
of
tipo
the
de perfil de paciente que você
placenta,
acha
is there any other
que,
profile
mesmo
of patients
tendo essa
that you
indicação
consider
off-label,
even having
eu
this
gostaria de
off-label
saber também a
specification
opinião da
worth it?
professora Vanessa a
I'd
respeito
like to know
disso.
Professor Vanessa's
Eu sei que não há
opinion, I know that there is no evidence, but from a practical point of view, the recommendation that were made for this webinar or the colleagues in prophylactic
Eu
use,
acho assim, se a gente pensar
I
que essa
think that if we
ela
consider
trabalha
that the
com
main cause of maternal
dispositivos
death
hipertensivos e
is
você tem a presença
hypertension,
da placa de
disturbia,
alopenia
and
nas
you have
né?
the presence of
Você tem
hyperclampsia,
a presença de distúrbio de
you have the
coagulação
presence of
precoce. Se esse distúrbio
disturbia,
de coagulação
coagulation
está
disturbia,
suspeita,
I think
aí
that
seria
the
uma boa
suspicion
indicação, né?
is
Além das
will be a
implantações
good
adequadas
indication on
no
top of the
território.
abnormal
Com a
implantation.
presença
So
de
the
uma
presence of a
predisposição
risk factor
considerável,
for
né, à
considerable atonia,
hipertensão combinada com
hypertension combined with
hipersensibilidemia,
hypertension in the
um
uterus,
parto prolongado,
prolonged
que traz esse uso ser
births,
mais
where
resistente à
you may become
ocitocina,
more
talvez esse
resistant
caso
to
também considerado,
oxytocin, and we will
tá?
also consider this.
Agora, assim, se
So
for
if
só uma
it's
coisa
not,
mais
if
rasa,
it's
tipo, no
something
paridade,
relied
no
on
paridade,
parity,
acho que não valeria tanta
I
pena,
don't think it will be
mas
worth it
fatores de
so
risco um
much.
pouquinho
But
maiores. E
a bit
para
higher
a questão da dose, eu acho que
risk factors will be
os
worth it.
ensaios
And for the
ambulatoriais
doctor
eram
that asked the
estudos que eram
dosage, I don't know if
transaminados
you're asking the dosage of the
só
study
através de
or the
estudos
dose that we
até de
would
uma
use it.
metodologia
The use of the
obstetric.
study, most of them used
Alguns
1 gram
estudos, como eu mostrei, né,
dosage.
teve o caso do
As I
Moderator, de
showed you,
dose
the
de 10
dose of milk,
miligramas por quilo,
they
que
used
dividiu
10
para 4
milligrams per
quilos,
kilo,
e aí
20
você
milligrams per
utilizou
kilo. There was a study they
15 miligramas
used
por
15
quilo, né?
milligrams per kilo,
Mas
but
nada que variasse muito
nothing
do
that
que
will
a gente usa
vary
no dia a
a
dia.
lot on what we use on our day-to-day
Eu o que eu
basis.
costumo fazer,
I
eu ensino
tend
as
to
pessoas
perform
por
1
questão de
fixed gram
praticidade
per
mesmo, né?
Raoult's practicity.
A gente acabou
Right.
usando
Well,
que o
we ended
Woman
up
Trial
using the woman trial,
preconiza, né? Aquele 1 grama,
what
10
it considers
minutos,
1
né?
gram,
E
10
aí aquelas
minutes,
primeiras 3 horas
when
pós
those first
hemorragia.
3 hours
Agora,
post-hemorrhage.
profilaticamente respondendo a pergunta da
Prophylactically
doutora,
answering question,
tem
Dr. Andre.
usos nas pacientes com
Use
alto
this on
risco
patients with a
específico,
high risk factor
principalmente
for
a
bleeding,
síndrome, né?
especially the Hill
Porque
syndrome.
a gente sabe que são pacientes que
We
vão
know
ser mais
that these are
rápidos,
patients
ter um
that
sangramento
will
maior,
bleed,
principalmente
have a
porque
higher bleeding,
essas
especially
pacientes,
because these
elas já têm
patients,
também distúrbio no
they already
fibrogênio,
have disturbance in the
assim como esse
fibrogenesis,
paciente do trauma, né, com a lesão
as
endotelial
well as strong patients
axial,
with endothelial pressure and
que poderiam realmente
tissue pressure, so
beneficiar
they could
do
actually
uso
benefit
profilático
when
antes
they
de um
use it
sangramento
prophylactic
severo.
use
E
before
também nas
intense bleeding,
hemorragias
so also
anormais,
on the
o
abnormal
acretismo, a
implantation.
hemorragia
So
concreta, né? Quando
cretism
você tá
or the
aquelas grandes
well, the
desgraças
big obstetric
obstétricas que a
uses that
gente
cretus
prefere
placentas, we
manter, né,
prefer
muito
not
mais
to have this,
distantes.
never going through this.
E algumas placentas prévias
A few
também
prior
que têm um risco
placentas
de
that
sangramento
also have
maior.
a risk of high risk of
Então
bleeding.
eu faço,
So I
acredito que seja benéfico
believe that will be
o
beneficial,
uso
and I do so.
profilático do ácido
The
tranexâmico.
prophylactic use of tranexamic
Concordo,
acid.
acho que essas situações também
I
seriam
agree. I
bem
think that
adequadas.
these situations are quite
A
adequate.
gente sabe que o ideal, né, claro,
You know
a
that what
gente
is
se
ideal,
antecipar,
we
né, do
anticipate
evento, né, do sangramento, né,
the
praticamente
bleeding,
tentar
bleeding
evitá-lo,
effect,
né,
and
porque
to
as
avoid
grandes
this
desgraças,
because
né, e as grandes
biggest issues, biggest
coagulopatias, elas são muito
coagulopathies,
ruins,
they are really bad.
os desfechos são muito
The
ruins,
outcomes are
principalmente nas
terrible,
pacientes
especially
obstétricas, né,
on obstetric patients.
sabemos disso, então
We know
eu acho
this,
que
so
o que a gente,
I think
o que a gente conseguir se cercar, né, previamente em
we
tratamentos e em
find ourselves in treatment.
profilaxia, eu acho que está de bom tamanho, né? A gente tem sempre que antecipar
We
a
Então,
basically
desgraça.
se a
have to
gente está falando
anticipate
de medicação
any issues.
com baixo
Talking
risco, né,
about
que
a
eu acho
medication
também
that
isso é
has a low
importante, não
risk, which is
falando de
tranexamic acid. We're
transfusão
talking about
profilática, que é uma coisa já
prophylactic
bem mais,
transfusion, which
né,
is something that
com muito
is
mais risco,
a lot more risk.
a balança penderia muito mais, né? Então,
Like
agora se a gente está
the
falando de uma
scales
medicação
will tend towards more one
mais,
side,
mais segura, nosso limiar para
safer.
uso ele pode ficar mais baixo, né?
E
They can
corroborando
actually
aqui o
be
do seu trabalho
lower.
também,
These just
que
can become lower. So
evidenciou
corroborating with your work with
que,
made it
tudo
evident
bem,
that
desfechos secundários, mas que reduziu
okay, so it's a secondary
a
outcome that
quantidade
reduced the
infusão
amount
de
of
concentrado de hemácias, né,
infusions of
dos
concentrated
sanguíneos,
hemocytes and
e
blood
também
products,
a
but
utilização em excesso de
also the
uterotônicos, né?
excessive use of
O
urotonics.
Eu acho que
excesso,
principalmente.
Then
além dos
mainly
urotônicos e diminuição dos produtos sanguíneos, né?
urotonics and diminishment of blood
Muito
of
interessante.
usage blood
Temos
medication.
mais questões?
Okay, do we have any other questions?
No Q&A, não.
Not
No
Q&A,
chat também não.
not in the chat.
Abro para
Does anybody,
presidente, nossa presidente, do
does
doutor
anybody
Plínio.
else? Dr. Plinio, President
Se quiser fazer
Mariangela,
algum comentário,
does anybody have a
alguma
question?
pergunta.
Anything else to ask? I'd just like to thank Ivo for his great work. And as you said, it's used just like Dipperone because of this therapeutic safety you have. But I think when you got to orthopedics, they listen, where you use it on any surgery. It's something that we see being popularized with tranexamic acid. Thank God it's very safe. It is safe. It's trendy, and sometimes they don't even know what they're doing different from the good indications that you cited here. So congrats, Ivo, for your good work. Thank you, Doctor. Professor Maria Angela, would you like to make any comments? No, I just wanted to thank you. I thought Ivo's presentation was very stimulating, very easy to understand. The way he presents, when we talk about meta-analysis, it's something like it's some kind of alien idea. You know? And you presented it in a very didactic manner. Actually seems simple the way you presented it. And it's not, but was very well presented, and I thought it was very practical discussion when it comes to the usage of TXA on a day-to-day basis. A satellite to the whole literature that is available to us. So really, great webinar, great webinar. Thank you, Ivo. Thank you, Andre, for calling Ivo to present, and Vanessa for moderating. She's an excellent moderator. Thank you so much. And so just to corroborating what Dr. Andre said, we need to remember that it's a very rich meta-analysis. It's a very rigorous analysis with a high scientific weight and ROP2 grade, so published on BJAN, and these are high quality papers and very well executed. So congrats to Dr. Andre for being our chief editor as well. No, congratulate the authors, actually. I think that the journal has received more high impact papers, and this is the idea. These are Brazilian groups. Brazilian groups, they actually went up their level. They're doing work that is very good, well done, and it really improves. It really brought a lot of quality and prestige to the publication, as Ivo did, publishing this paper on the journal. Really need to access content that the journal was published and has been higher and a higher quality always time. So I congratulate the authors. So really promoting their work through the journal. So congratulations to research, especially Brazilian researchers in general, and congratulations, Ivo. Great presentation, great discussion. I'm sure it was very fruitful to everyone. Thank you very much. Right, great. Since there is no longer any questions, Dr. Mauricio Bosco as well, congratulations. So, closing statements by Dr. Ivo. Any comments? I want to thank the opportunity of John able to show our work here. As Dr. Mariangela said, a lot of time performing this work, and we present this in 10 minutes. Does not represent a lot of the work that we had. It's very gratifying that all these costs present results, and as much as our work has performed as and according to the work has been done.
A gente focar nessa questão de que a nossa realidade, né, e muitos anestesistas, pelo menos aqui em
A
Brasília,
lot of anesthesiologists on public as well as private medicine situations where we have very few researchers, and I think that this is a type of work that we thought a lot about this because we need to perform the things that are aimed towards our reality. There's no point in us testing medications, equipment that is very expensive. Sure, there will be a European group that's doing this work, and most of the anesthesiologists in Brazil would not have the chance of making use of these results. So thank you to BJAN for this opportunity.
Excelente lembrar que no Brasil,
So
né,
just
é
remember
a
that
segunda maior causa de mortalidade
the second
materna,
highest cause of
a hemorragia
maternal
pós-parto.
mortality
Isso
is
pode para
postpartum bleeding. It
hipertensão,
only
por
loses to
hipertensivos,
hypertension
né,
and hypertensive
pela
disease
falta de
due to the
tratamento,
lack
né, de
of
emergência, de
treatment,
pré-natal. Então, quer dizer, mas estão ali,
but
estão
it's
muito
there,
próximas.
very
E
close.
realmente a gente pode fazer
And really, we
diferença nos
can make a
desfechos
difference on our
desses
outcomes
pacientes.
by these patients.
Então,
So
eu fecho aqui
I close
o nosso
this,
webinar,
close our
agradecendo
webinar,
a presença de todos.
thanking
Uma
everyone's
boa
presence,
noite, um bom descanso, um
and
bom plantão para quem está de plantão.
everybody have a
E
good
até a
rest, and we see you
próxima.
next time.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very
Até a
much.
próxima.
Good evening.
Até a próxima.
Great work. Till next time. Bye-bye.